resilient or don't seem to have it, if we define resilience by the lack of having a problem, as many people are indeed resilient in that sort of context. And it might be predicted by being, if you're an adult, being resilient, better adolescent mental health. Identifying one parent as very caring or feeling that one parent loved you. Positive relationships with peers or adult friendships and the stability of adult love relationships. And all of us who've ever worked clinically will remember the patients we've seen who've had these tragic life histories and difficulties, but these variables are very common in the clinical context. We also looked at the Cowie Highs birth code, and this I don't have authorities for because the report didn't identify them, but the same themes have come up from work like Anne Maston's Ordinary Magic and Norman Gomesi's work about the resilience of children in environments of profound adversity, which didn't necessarily focus on the abuse, but the profound social adversity and neglect, and highlighted how much the issue of temperament, disposition, intelligence, some of the resources children might bring to them, affectional bonds in family and believing that someone out there might love you, external support system, and school and others. Much of this we know, but don't act on. And my reason for repeating it is that, and it's interesting that Patricia Mrazek and her husband, she particularly led the prevention work in the US, report from the Institute of Medicine on Prevention and Mental Health, wrote this long before that report, highlighting some of the findings in how children who are abused make adaptations which are part of their resilience or attempts to heal. And she quoted of interest in this narrative of resilience, and I keep coming back to this thread of narratives because some of the work we do, whether or not it's in a structure, the CBT model, or in other forms of healing, or other forms of therapy, is often about the capacity to bring your narrative resilience in play or other ways to the surface. And she quoted the Australian novel A Fortunate Life as one exemplar of this. But the spirit of survival and testimony is as critical as many of you will have seen in the work that you've done. Family functioning. Sarah Ollison and colleagues at the Australian National University did a very interesting examination of the household and income labour set data for Australia, elder data, looking at the versus. It didn't look at child sexual abuse because it was not looked at. Found how frequent in Australian populations adversities are in children's lives, and they tended to cluster in 20% or so. Poverty, single parenthood is found in the National Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing Child and Adolescent in 2000 and in that rather late 1990s 2000, clustered very strongly with poorer child and adolescent mental health. Sadly, despite the fact there's been an adult survey repeated, not identified resources to repeat the Australian child and adolescent survey, but we'll be pursuing that. A very good report through the National Clearinghouse for Child Abuse and Neglect by Price Robinson drew together a lot of Australian studies about estimates of the prevalence in Australia. Physical abuse, 5 to 10%. And this is on research studies from people, some of you may be in this room, but certainly strong and good research studies. Neglect, much harder to emotional maltreatment, 11%. Witnessing family violence, to 23%. And non-penetrative abuse. And these figures are staggering when you look at them. This is a huge proportion of children. Between 4 and 80% having penetrative sexual abuse, which is rape, and 7 to 12% of females. Clustering again with family functioning adversities, but chilling in that we haven't stopped it. There's some suggestion maybe the rates are lower, but because the states and territories report differently, it's very hard to make those judgments. Multiple studies here, and Rosamund Rogers is one of the most interesting ones in the PATH project in Canberra. Again, chiefly retrospective, but interesting in that they find that a significant number of people have some adversity, and severe adversity such as physical and sexual abuse and neglect are common and frequent and cluster. They've also asked about happiness and normality. And they found that if as an adult you rated your childhood as not happy, it was much more likely to correlate with the sorts of things that are clustered around child abuse and neglect. If you report your child which is not normal, is similarly the case. Not happy and not normal was bad outlook. Substance abuse, conflict, all the same sorts of things. Women had more adversities. And so what have we done? What's been done? A lot of the things that are developed in improving our own network are new distance resources, and they're an important basis because they contribute lots of information and knowledge. This data is not yet loaded up onto our network, but will be in due course. National networks, National Association for Prevention of Child Abuse, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, the National Child Protection Clearinghouse, care systems in different states and territories with protection and counselling, child and adolescent mental health, mentor programs. Each state's got little bits of things where it's nipping away trying to bring these things together to do better. Having chaired the National Prevention Initiative for a decade and recently reviewed the Health and Hospital Reform documents, prevention for child and adolescent mental health virtually doesn't occur or is mentioned in words that are passing. There is no initiative for that. Smoking, drinking and all of the things that are practical and clear that people can see and you can have a righteous belief about, but very little that touches on what's needed here, and an unwillingness in the face of the high demand for adult services to engage such issues. We've got some interesting work, and I know Kevin Ronan's here, and he and his colleagues have done, as have other workers, trying to look at what sort of way you would manage people who have experienced profound abuse and neglect, and what you would do. And this work, which has been very detailed, and I think I'm fair in saying in what I've read, not as yet a randomised control trial, has shown decreased and increased coping. What it highlights for me is the subtlety and flexibility that needs to come into managing this. This is no circumstance to make the child confront what happened, because when the child's been profoundly abused, their world is one filled with trauma. They're immersed, and I think that concept of immersion, which goes back to the work of Robert J. Lifton after Hiroshima, how you're immersed in the ongoing implications and profoundness of trauma and loss, is critical in how difficult it is often to both set a way of managing and how you can help people move from the immersion field. Burdens and consequences, a good review has really highlighted some of those issues. The Productivity Commission in Australia has shown a report that it costs Australia, at the time of this, which was 2007 data, nearly $4 billion annually. And that doesn't include everything that I've mentioned at all. A national framework's been developed by COAD for 2009 to 20. Protecting children is everyone's business, early intervention, prevention, better support, but I've not yet seen the funds allocation and a system to make this work. And having tried to have sign up to systems, every state's got some good things that are happening, but getting a national process forward has been, to date, an extremely difficult thing to tackle these sorts of complex and socially sensitive problem areas. Prevention, we have the nurse 100% from the old thing, replicated everywhere and effective in making things better along the lifespan. We've got the excellent work from the Triple P and the Incredible Years programs, but particularly Triple P, which has been done at population levels and integrated into systems and can make a difference over 2 years and longer. Developed by Matt Sanders at the University of Queensland and extended into many other countries, but not across Australia. We don't herald heroes in our own country very well. Resilience, the Kids Matter initiatives through schools, and the APS is going to be a helpful thing in building resilience, and there's been some excellent programs addressing this, including ones developed here in Queensland and the programs looking at prevention in school settings. But nothing consistent has happened to really tackle this, and the dark secrets, the dark trauma, still stays hidden because it's very difficult to move into and address that area. Child continuities can make a difference, parental support, the Cockney initiatives, which are progressing very widely. All of those things can help, but it's still the untouchable and the secret. There's many complex and interesting studies which I'm not going into, and for the moment, class myself as an expert in, but we note that even ageing can be accelerated by child abuse. and the protective effects of affection, stimulation, and oxytocin are being explored. Indigenous children know more than any others, and very much highlighted by the Western Australian Aboriginal Child Health Survey, child and social and emotional wellbeing, parent taken away, and all of the abuse and clustering of family adversities. Increased risk of all disorders. And if you've had more of these adversities, it's all around 2 or 3 adversities, things seem to tip. If we talk of a tipping point concept out of the popular psychological literature and resilience, this fits with work that's been going on for a long time about the clustering and multiplicity of adversities in this context. No illnesses, no stresses, and care and no violence are protective. Child sexual abuse was looked at by Lila Khoury in 2000 for the Australian government by a report commissioned by Senator Bill Heffernan, and yet nothing was done following the findings of that. Nothing that changed. And then we have, as we go on now, despite the enormous resilience and courage that Aboriginal people have shown, we know that many worries still affect them. The longitudinal study of Indigenous children, Footprints in Time, shows how much big worry, stress and sadness, the death of a family member. And when Pat and I went around the country, I went to more funerals in 6 weeks than I've been to in the whole of the rest of my life. Violent deaths, motor vehicle accidents, fights. Most parents rate things positively. They're full of optimism and hope, affection, despite the despair. The demonstrability of this is profound. And the many interesting healing programs, some of which I've been involved with, which focus on encompassing the cultural, spiritual base of understanding, experience, and in using strength to go forward. And Lorraine Peters and Rosemary Wanganeen have really done some very interesting work. But I come to the last point on this slide, the intervention. Do we have any knowledge, apart from disruption of the systems that were protected for Aboriginal people, what has been achieved? We know the possible health gains, and this highlights a great many of the problems that we face as a nation, the failure to address what we might do. A good summary highlight the importance of safety first and the culture of family and what removal of the child may mean, and the problems that arise for many of you might know in the context of being in foster homes or other settings. The things that we could do that might make it better, and the traumatisation that's occurred for children in care. Prevention of future harm and health promotion are critical issues in this, and the particular issues that arise for families who come to this country, as we all did one or another as boat people, and yet have additional tragedies on top of the trauma that they may have experienced in the transition process, superimposed by their transition into this country with further trauma. And the whole issue of abuse and problems in childhood being a matter of shame. And the issues of gender, which have not been much touched on but are critical in this context. The devaluing of female children may be part of why they become property in such circumstances across many cultures, including Western. Now I'm going to talk very briefly on trauma and loss of circumstance. I've used this phrase because I'm respectful of the vast body of work that's been done about this, and I'm not going to talk in detail. It's about accidents, assaults, the excellent work that Justin Canardi's been doing here. Many of you have been doing great work in these fields. Familiar natural disasters that people have been used to, the floods, the cyclones, and the work that's done gently in various ways and often through non-government agencies supporting families when they've lost a parent. I know it's legacy day to day, and the great work that's been done in many circumstances in the past supporting military families. Recognition and response is much more frequent here. Sadly, there's sometimes an invasion of the trauma counsellors, and we've seen some good sides of that elsewhere. But there are care systems, there's response systems and capacity to act in these circumstances. There's good models, good care and growing evidence, focal therapies, and the work Brett's done in disasters is a very important part of that. But anyone I haven't mentioned, it's no intention to leave out multiple excellent pieces of work that have been done. Inherent in much of this is our capacity to tell our story in our way and with some control. One of the worst things about an intrusive trauma therapy is that it intrudes on a circumstance where there was no control, where you couldn't control and keep it out and stop the trauma. And yet when you have a therapy which takes over control, that's not a good thing. The therapy model which gives control and gives choice and gives time is a critical part of how people choose their own pathways of resilience and adaptation. And as we know from the excellent work presented this morning by George, and as many others know in the surveys that have been following disasters, it's still profound. I'd like to draw this talk to its close and some questions about the other major process that we now face, which I've chosen to call mass catastrophe. And this relates very much to the mass natural disasters, but also encompasses the threats of terrorism, which are more subtle, sometimes not quite so lethal, but pervasive, and war and insurgency, which we're all engaged, sadly, in one way or another. One of the things that struck me, while the first one was in the dark, this is in the light, at least in the beginning. There's the glare, the media, non-stop coverage. Some of that, as we know, potentially traumatising for children. The convergence of assistance, focus on survival and aid. We know from many of the bits of work we've done in descriptive terms that sometimes that